Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question asks if I can analyze the mental health and personality characteristics that may be at work in the Stephanie Lazarus case. Stephanie Lazarus is a murderer who committed a murder in 1986 and was not arrested until 2009. So just a reminder that the people that I'm talking about in this video are real people, so I'm not diagnosing anybody, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. So first I'll take a look at the timeline of the crime, then talk about some background, like how these different people got into this position, the investigation and the trial, and then I'll look at the mental health and personality factors. So starting with the timeline, we start here at February 24, 1986 in Van Nuys, California. A man named John Rutten leaves his condominium to drive to work. His wife, Sherry Rasmussen, a 29-year-old nursing administrator, was debating whether or not she should go to work that day. She was thinking about calling in sick because she had a task to do that she did not enjoy. John left the home at about 7:20 a.m. At that point, Sherry was still undecided as to whether or not she was going into work. During that morning, one of the neighbors noticed that the garage was open and there was no car in the garage. John Rutten called home around mid-morning and there was no answer. Assuming that Sherry had decided to go to work, he called her office, but her secretary indicated that she had not seen Sherry. John called home 3 or 4 more times, but did not get an answer, and the answering machine had not been turned on. When both of them left the home, the last one out would normally turn on the machine. That same morning, we see that a maid who was cleaning a nearby condominium reported she heard 2 people in an argument, and she heard the sound of something falling. She did not hear gunshots. When John returned home from work, he noticed some broken glass on the driveway, and the garage door was still open. Sherry's car, a silver BMW, was not in the garage. He entered the condominium and found Sherry dead on the floor in the living room. She was barefoot and wearing a red bathrobe. John touched her skin, but it was cold, and he could not find a pulse. He dialed 911. When the police arrived, they discovered that Sherry had been shot 3 times with .38 caliber bullets. There was a lot of damage to the contents of the home, as if there had been some sort of fight. There was this gray ceramic vase that was broken. There was a stereo speaker laying on the ground next to her. We see that there was a VCR and a CD player that had been stacked neatly, as if somebody was getting ready to remove them from the house. The CD player also had a single smear of blood on top of it. There was also some blood on one of the walls and near the front door. One of the glass sliding doors upstairs was shattered, and that glass matched what was found in the driveway. Sherry had injuries consistent with trying to defend herself. She had a bite on her inner right forearm and a bruise on her face that seemed consistent with the shape of a barrel of a gun. She had also been beaten. The police also noticed that a quilted blanket in the living room chair had a hole in it with powder burns around it. They deduced that 1 shot was fired, and then the quilt was placed between Sherry and the firearm, and 2 more shots were fired. So the blanket was used to muffle the sound of the gunshots. Sherry's BMW was discovered a week later, parked on a street. The keys were in the ignition, and the doors were unlocked. Fingerprints, 1 strand of brown hair, and a small amount of blood were recovered from the vehicle. The police formed a theory of the crime. There had been reports of 2 men breaking into homes in the area, and in one instance they assaulted a woman. They combined this with the evidence of the crime scene, and they were led to believe that Sherry surprised 2 male burglars, and those burglars murdered her before they fled. They ignored the fact that there was no forced entry. There was a jewelry box that was left untouched, even though it was in plain view. The VCR and the CD player that looked like they had been prepared to be stolen because of the way they were stacked, they had Sherry's blood on them, suggesting the attack happened before the items were stacked. They also ignored the fact the perpetrator fired 2 shots through the sliding glass door upstairs, yet fatally shot Sherry downstairs. If a burglar was trying to escape, why would they go upstairs, confront the resident, and then chase them downstairs and fatally shoot them? Why not just run away? Now moving to the background. So with this case, I'm going to give the background to give some context about the players involved here. So this isn't so much the background of Stephanie Lazarus, but the background of the whole situation that may have led to this crime. When John Rutten was in college, he dated a woman named Stephanie Lazarus. John reported that Stephanie was never his girlfriend, and that in a 3-year time period from 1981 to 1984, they had sex 20 to 30 times. After college, John went on to work for a manufacturer, and Lazarus entered into the police academy. Eventually, she became a uniformed officer with the Los Angeles Police Department. Not long after this, John met Sherry Rasmussen, and they started dating. Stephanie Lazarus threw a surprise party for John on his 25th birthday. She did not know that John was involved with Sherry. It was at this party when she found out about Sherry. Evidently, Sherry was devastated by this news that John had a romantic partner. She felt as though she was truly in love with John, and she did not understand his decision. She visited John in his condominium, and they had sex, even though John was engaged to Sherry. John later reported that this was done in order to give Stephanie closure. After this, we see an incident with water skis. Lazarus brought the skis to John and asked him if he would wax them. John agreed to do this, and Sherry questioned John about the nature of his relationship with Stephanie. After Stephanie came by to pick up the water skis, Sherry told her to leave, so she made it fairly clear that she did not want her around. Sherry became more forceful with John, insisting that he stand up to Stephanie. John essentially told her that it was just better to ignore Stephanie, and eventually she would just go away. Stephanie showed up again at the home, this time wearing a uniform. Sherry was there, but John was not. This caused an awkward situation. Shortly after this, Sherry reported that she believed Stephanie was stalking her on the street, and we see an incident at Sherry's place of work. Stephanie came in to where Sherry worked and told her that if she cannot have John, no one else will. And she became aggressive. So this seems like a pretty good clue that things aren't working out here. And we see after the murder of Sherry, Stephanie and John reunited briefly again in 1989, after John contacted the police and asked him if he was sure that there was nothing that tied Stephanie to the murder. So he was having some suspicions at that point, but he still went and saw her. John would later remarry, and Stephanie was promoted to detective and would marry another police officer later on. So now moving to the investigation. So the first investigation concluded that this was a burglary gone wrong. And even though the police were still looking for the perpetrators, they were not looking very hard. Sherry's father had suggested to the police that perhaps Stephanie Lazarus was the killer. They told him he watched too much television. In 2004, evidence from the murder investigation was re-examined using new DNA testing techniques that had actually been developed several years before. The saliva that was collected at the crime scene came from a female. A criminalist inquired as to whether the woman who had harassed the victim, both at her place of employment and at her home, had ever been investigated, of course referring to Stephanie Lazarus. She was told that Stephanie Lazarus was an LAPD detective, and she was not involved. It was a burglary gone bad, so the evidence was placed back in storage. It wasn't until 2009 that officers willing to investigate the crime became involved. They generated a list of 5 female suspects. Lazarus, who was a pretty good suspect, was still last on the list because she was a police officer. The detectives became alarmed when they eliminated 4 suspects and only Lazarus remained. They were frightened because Lazarus was a detective and her husband was a detective as well. They found out that Lazarus owned a Smith & Wesson Model 49, a .38 caliber revolver, and she had reported that weapon stolen just 13 days after the murder. They also discovered that Lazarus was not working on the day of the murder. Eventually, the detectives were able to collect DNA from a discarded cup and straw that Lazarus had used. The detectives created a careful plan to arrest Lazarus on June 5, 2009. They had other officers call her and tell her she was needed to meet a suspect at the lockup in the Parker Center. This was the police administration building. No one was allowed to take a gun into that area, so the detectives thought that would be safer. The detectives confronted Stephanie and admitted that they had lied, that they had summoned her down to that area under false pretenses. They said they just wanted to talk about the Rasmussen case. Stephanie did not ask for an attorney, and she answered many questions about John and Sherry in a way that really minimized how well she knew them. Now that's at first, but then she kind of admitted she knew them much better than that. This interview went on for over an hour. It really hurt her case. She shouldn't have talked at all, of course, if she wanted to remain out of prison. But I find this interview interesting because her demeanor, I think, does give us some indication as to what she was thinking and feeling. So looking at her behavior during this interview, we see a lot of over-describing. She offers a ton of irrelevant details. They had nothing to do with what the detectives were asking. She had periods in that interview where she really rapidly talked, and that was more during the times when she was giving a lot of those unnecessary details. She appeared annoyed and exacerbated at points, and she also hesitated at other points, kind of like she was searching her memory. She would say, "Let me think back." She often took a lot of time to answer a question, especially if the question had kind of an incriminating component to it. It was like she was trying to decide what to say. Should she tell the truth, or should she select among a number of potential lies? She rattled off a number of dates and emphasized how long ago this whole situation occurred. She talked about like how it was 20-something years ago. How could anybody remember? It was so long ago, nobody could be expected to recall that. When asked about Sherry, she said in the beginning that she may have met Sherry. Then she said she did meet her. Then she indicated that she may have had a conversation with Sherry about them both dating John. She admitted that she talked to John after Sherry's death. She talked about how she met John in Hawaii in 1989. That's that brief reunion I talked about before. She said, "I'm thinking that John met us there," talking about her and a friend that had been there when John arrived. So again, she was just kind of keeping her options open. The way she worded things, she didn't want to commit to something because she didn't know what the detectives might have already known. When she was first asked, did the relationship with John start again after Sherry's death, she said, "I would say no." Right? Of course, she admitted that she did have a relationship with him after Sherry's death. I already talked about that. But I found this interesting, the way she worded this. I would say no. Instead of just saying the word no, she's, again, being quite careful, or she thinks she's being careful. She took a long time to answer questions that she knew the detectives had the answer to. So, like she was stalling. They asked what John's address was. I guess the address he was at before he moved to that condominium. Of course, the detectives really didn't need to know that information, and we see that Stephanie takes a long time to answer that. Kind of like buying time so she can start thinking about the other lies that she needs to tell to cover up later in the interview. Now, with these detectives, I didn't actually think they did that good a job. I felt like they were much too obvious. They were playing like they did not know things that they clearly would have known. But still, they easily outflanked Sherry. So even though she was a detective, they outmaneuvered her by quite a margin. She became annoyed eventually and said she wanted to talk to an attorney. When she tried to leave, she was arrested. Her home was searched and a journal was discovered in which she discusses how she was despondent over losing John Rutten. Now, even though she was arrested for murder, she was granted an early retirement, right? I find this interesting. How is this a priority at this particular time? But I guess that money would keep coming in, and that could help pay for her legal fees. So I guess I can understand that. Now moving to the trial. This was far from an open and shut case. There was evidence that Lazarus was despondent about that relationship with John, but also that she was despondent about many failed relationships. John was just one of those people. The defense was able to cast doubt about the quality of the DNA analysis. In the end, though, the prosecution was successful. We see in March 2012, Stephanie was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to 27 years to life in prison, eligible for parole in 2034. She was 52 at the time of her conviction, so she could get out at age 74. Now taking a look at the mental health and personality factors that may be at work in a case like this. So Stephanie Lazarus is actually fairly interesting. She had no criminal or disciplinary history. Now it's important to remember the context, though. She worked for the police department, and they didn't really seem too keen on investigating fellow officers. So, yeah, she didn't have a history, but it's hard to know if that's because she didn't do anything or they just didn't follow up. By just about every report, Stephanie was an upstanding citizen. Other than her arrest for murder and having a temper, we really don't see much in terms of indications that she would commit a crime like this. So what characteristics does her behavior align with? Well, we see quite a few here. Overconfidence, pathological lying, and manipulation. We see this interview by the detectives took her by surprise. She was probably quite certain she had gotten away with the murder. She thought she could talk her way out of this situation when clearly the detectives were interviewing her because she was a suspect. We also see rage, callousness, and impulsivity. Even though she used her knowledge of police work to mislead investigators, she left a lot of evidence behind at the crime scene. She also used her gun, which is not consistent with intelligence. The murder she committed really had components of premeditation and impulsivity. So we saw a mix of both. We see a sense of entitlement and jealousy here. She was not going to be rejected without a consequence. And we see a lack of remorse. How did she go for 23 years with all the guilt of committing that murder? Well, perhaps there was no guilt. Now, I've heard theories about antisocial personality disorder and psychopathy, which is related to that. I've heard theories about narcissistic personality disorder as well as borderline personality disorder. The challenge here is that we really don't know a lot about Stephanie, and we don't know a lot about her history. So we do see an alignment with a few antisocial personality characteristics. So if we look at the symptoms of antisocial personality disorder, we do see repeated unlawful behaviors, the murder, covering up the murder, and then lying later on. We see consistent deceitfulness, impulsivity, aggressiveness, a reckless disregard for safety, irresponsibility, and the lack of remorse I talked about. But all these characteristics are really in the context of Stephanie threatening Sherry before the murder itself, and the interrogation 23 years later. We don't really know what happened before that. We don't know what happened between the murder and the interrogation. There's just no way to figure out if this is truly a pattern of behavior or if it was isolated to just these particular instances. When it comes to narcissistic personality disorder, we don't really see a lot of alignment here either. Maybe manipulation, lacking empathy, and envy. But again, we run to the same problem of whether this was really a long-term pattern or not. And that brings me to borderline personality disorder. This is an interesting theory. There is some alignment here with frantic efforts to avoid abandonment. We see all those journal entries about being despondent, about losing romantic relationships, and of course, we see anger. But I don't think this is really about getting John back, like winning him back as a romantic partner, but more about getting revenge on him and Sherry. I think this was really about making them suffer for the pain that she believed that they caused her. It wasn't about, again, reestablishing the relationship with John. Now, she might have done that briefly in 1989, but the murder occurred in 1986. So if her objective was to win him back, she waited 3 years to have any meaningful contact. That just seems a little inconsistent with that goal. So in a situation like this, we may see some cluster B traits, but it's hard to link it to a specific pathology. So I have some other thoughts here on this case. What went wrong here, right? Like, how did somebody get away with this murder for so long? We see delayed justice. Well, the police believed from the beginning that either John or the mysterious burglars committed this crime. The original detective actually ruled out Stephanie Lazarus as a suspect because John told him it was not possible. Forensic samples from the crime scene that may have contained DNA were removed from the coroner's office by a police officer as part of a routine transfer, but never entered into the case file. The bite swab was accidentally left in the coroner's office. Now, that detective who removed the forensic samples had no memory of signing them out. Interestingly, other evidence like audio recordings were also missing. So the police department denied having any involvement in a cover-up, but the evidence strongly points to either a cover-up or being incredibly incompetent, right? I think they're in one of those situations where they more or less have to admit to one or the other. Now, Stephanie Lazarus actually had access to the case file before she was arrested. Not immediately before, but for many years after the murder, even though she had a prior relationship with the victim's husband. I find this really incredible. Why was this permitted? It doesn't make any sense at all. Now, before she worked in the art theft division, she had worked in internal affairs and homicide. So this is kind of frightening that she went undetected and was able to infiltrate in all these areas of law enforcement when she, in fact, had committed a homicide. Now, on this point of how the police seem to give other police officers a pass, police officers commit crimes every day, just like many people do. They are not exempt from this component of the human condition. Giving Lazarus a pass simply because she was a police officer is offensive to logic and reason. Furthermore, of course, it delayed justice in this case. Another point here is about the burglary theory. So a number of people looked at this case and thought these detectives were really way off for believing that a burglar committed the murder. But this theory wasn't really that ridiculous considering the evidence they had. I find it curious how, after the DNA implicated Lazarus, many people involved in the case said, oh yeah, a burglar would never murder somebody. They would never bite somebody. They would never shoot somebody through a quilt. Because what, burglars are like little angels, right? Of course burglars can commit these crimes. It was just that the crime scene pointed to an intentional homicide more so than an unexpected confrontation. Now, a lot of people have discussed how John had sex with Stephanie while he was engaged, and many think this contributed to the murder. Now, he specifically acknowledged that this was a mistake when he was at the trial. That's a bit of an understatement. Now, I don't know if it contributed to the murder, but certainly it was not a good idea, right? This is problematic. This reminds me of the Jodi Arias case, where the victim had sex with her even though she was stalking him. So it seems pretty clear that John knew that there was stalking behavior, yet he still did this. Now, he claimed, as I mentioned before, that this was done to bring closure for Stephanie. I find this difficult to believe. I think a better explanation is that they wanted to have sex. They were attracted to one another, right? So he simply cheated on his fiancée. It seems actually fairly straightforward. It's just one of those unfortunate events that can't be clearly tied to what happened, but it does make a lot of people wonder what was really going on there. So I know whenever I talk about cases like the Stephanie Lazarus murder, there will be a variety of opinions. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be interesting. Thanks for watching.